Hi everyone, welcome to part 1 of Mental Health in Life and Sport for SMD 210. So within these lectures, we have a couple of different objectives, but for part 1, we're going to focus on reviewing mental health and stigmas in sport. So first, let's talk about participation in sport in general. And what I want you to do to start off with this lecture is think about pros and cons that exist for participating in sports. So you should address the following: sociocultural effects of participation in sports, psychological effects of participation in sports, and physiological effects of participation in sports. And hopefully you'll be able to name pros or cons. However, what we're going to do is split you up into two main groups. So depending on your actual article assignment groups for this class, groups 1 through 3 on your ticket and worksheet will list pros for participation in sports, and groups 4 through 6 will list cons for participation in sports. And again, if you're with pros, you should be able to address sociocultural, psychological, and physiological effects, as many as you can. And if you're with cons, you'll only list the cons for sociocultural, psychological, physiological. So for example, a pro for psychological effects could be argued that participating in sport increases self-esteem. A con for physiological effects might be risk for serious injury, such as concussions. Pause the video to write your pros or cons for participating in sports on your worksheet. We will discuss your pros and cons list in class, but it should be noted that in general, there definitely are positives for participating in sports. And a couple of these positives include positive self-esteem and self-efficacy. Self-esteem is defined as a person's subjective, emotional evaluation of one's self-worth, and self-efficacy is defined as an individual's belief in his or their capacity to execute behaviors necessary to produce specific performance attainments, essentially their evaluation of their ability to complete a task. Research has shown that participation in sports actually has a positive influence on an athlete's self-esteem and self-efficacy in general. So let's talk about mental health in sport. Sport participation has been shown to both hinder and improve the mental health of athletes. So the question is, does athletic involvement cause an increase in positive mental health? Or do athletes with positive mental health choose to participate in athletics? Essentially, is it the chicken or the egg? There are a couple different possible explanations depending on how you look at it. Athletics require mental stability. So those with mental health issues may be less likely to begin or continue participation in sport. Also, some might argue that there's a large dropout rate in teams and sports that may be due to mental health issues. So potentially athletes who struggle with mental health issues may be less likely to continue on in their sport and thus drop out. Or it could be that athletes don't necessarily report their mental health issues at the same rate of general population. We're going to look at prevalence rates of different mental health disorders in athlete and non-athlete populations. And depending on the different mental health issues, prevalence rates vary. But either way, we do know that there are plenty of athletes who struggle with mental health issues. So, therefore, we're going to bust the myth right away. Participation in sports or being an athlete does not make you immune to mental health issues. Despite benefits of physical activity, student athletes, specifically collegiate student athletes, may be at the same or higher risk for mental health issues as the general population and even college students. And we're going to look at what those populations look like as far as prevalence and mental health disorders. Consider the amount of stress you, as a college student, experience day to day in dealing with timelines, deadlines, studying, exams, projects, research, etc. Now consider the role of a college student athlete and the amount of potential stress they might also have on their plate in addition to their role as being a college student. Participating in collegiate student athletics may cause excessive stress from time constraints, other required academic and athletic related commitments, the transitional period of the first year of college, the first collegiate sports season, and high risk of injury in sports. This excessive stress can create an imbalance of pressures, and this imbalance potentially can lead to mental health issues such as anxiety and depression. So let's take a look specifically at depression prevalence in the college population. Reported prevalence rates do vary, but most literature cite that 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 college students experience depression in a year's worth of time. Around 50% struggled with depression at some point in their college career. Suicide is ranked as the second leading cause of death among young people between the ages 20 and 24, with 12.7 deaths per 100,000 college-age adults. Over a 13-year period, one study found that the number of students seeking counseling services help for mental health issues doubled, and the rate of students with suicidal ideation tripled. And that study was done back in 2003, so there's a potential that those numbers are even higher today. Now let's take a look at depression prevalence in student-athlete populations. The reported prevalence rates vary from 13.5% to 26% in student-athlete populations. These numbers may vary depending on competition level, so NCAA Division I versus Division III, for example, or Olympic level versus high school level student-athletes. It may vary depending on sport. For example, my research has found that there's a higher risk for developing depression symptoms in collegiate women's volleyball players compared to other fall collegiate athletic sports. And number 3, the prevalence rates may vary and often do vary depending on sex or gender. In society, females are at higher risk of developing depression, and this is also true in student-athlete populations. But one of the main ways that prevalence rates are controlled, and especially when we're talking about reported prevalence rates, so individuals coming forward and stating that they're experiencing depression symptoms or mental health in society, is this negative stigma tied to mental health. In our society, mental health is not often talked about in the open. As one quote states, "It's so common, it could be anyone. The trouble is, nobody wants to talk about it, and that makes everything worse." There are some negative myths or stigmas that are historically tied to mental health in our society. The first, that having a psychological issue may label you as quote-unquote crazy. In addition, it's a major myth that if we don't talk about it, mental health then maybe just doesn't exist, or it's not really a problem, or hopefully it will go away. And lastly, one other myth is that mental health issues are all quote-unquote in your head, or that someone could just think it away or hope that it's gone. I once had somebody tell me that if someone's struggling with depression and they're sad, why don't they just be happy and change how they're thinking? If it were that easy, obviously the prevalence rates would not be so high in our society and affecting athletes in the United States. Let's consider mental health in our society. 1 in 4 adults will be diagnosed with a mental health disorder in their lifetime. That number is astounding. If you think about all the people you know in your life, 1 in 4 in their adult lifetime may be diagnosed with some sort of mental health issue. That's how common it is. Yet, there's still a major stigma where people may feel ashamed or embarrassed to talk about mental health in our society, even though it's so common, and more common than many physical ailments or illnesses that we freely and openly talk about. This stigma seriously affects individuals' ability to gain appropriate access to health care in treating mental health issues. So now let's touch on the negative stigma of mental health in sports. So in addition to this negative stigma that athletes might experience in society and in their life in general, there's also a negative stigma surrounding mental health tied specifically to being an athlete. So one myth, or historically how we viewed athletes, is that athletes are mentally tough and that therefore they can't or don't experience mental health issues. Another is that an athlete, if they're struggling with a mental health issue, then maybe they're seen as weak or not at the elite level or viewed that they can't perform as well. And again, as we spoke about before, as an athlete, someone might have pressure from their teammates or coaches if they're struggling with a mental health issue that they can't necessarily see how they're struggling compared to a sprained ankle or a fractured bone. This is very similar to concussion injuries, in which you can't always see the effects or the influences of a concussion injury. And the person who's experiencing the injury has to experience that without truly being able to show others around them what they're going through. Given the major negative stigma surrounding mental health in sport, and the pressures student athletes experience in addition to their role as college students, there's a good chance that mental health issues in sport are much more prevalent than we're aware of or than are reported. So if student athletes may be underreporting mental health issues, in addition to the negative stigma surrounding mental health, what are some reasons why student athletes don't report or seek help for these issues? Pause the video now to answer this question on your worksheet. Potentially, if we are able to change the negative stigma of mental health and talk more openly and comfortably about mental health, more athletes may report issues, and thus, more athletes will get the access to mental health care they might really need. We will discuss this further in class. Therefore, moral of the story, we need to keep talking about mental health, and that's definitely what we're going to do in class. Now move on to the next video.